Welcome to Faith Vocals. My name is Faith. Recently on this channel, I have been looking at movies, at the stories we find in them, at the meaning we find within those stories, especially the meaning to me as a Christian. I incorporate my Christian faith into what I've been commenting on. I want to try something a bit new for this channel. I want to try to give you some of the visuals for these movies. That's not something I've been able to do up until this point. And I thought that what I would do is, as I am pulling together the clips for the movies that I want to use, I would actually comment while I'm editing on the segments that I'm seeing and what I'm seeing in those segments. So we'll see how this works. As you're watching the video, you may find that my shirt, my hairstyle may change from one cut of me to another. That's because the process of making this video is going over several days. And so I'm not going to worry about having a consistent wardrobe or anything. I am going to, on the day that I'm working, just sit down and talk to you across the camera as I'm doing now. So that I can give you what I'm seeing here. Today the movie that we're looking at is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, an old Capra classic. So the first scene I want to talk about here is where Governor Hopper is sitting down to dinner with his family. He's known as Happy throughout the movie. And he's got a real struggle going on, because he's supposed to pick a senator to replace one that has already passed away. This senator is going to go to Washington, D.C. to represent the state, which, by the way, in the movie remains unnamed. The movie doesn't get into anything that could be remotely considered political, even though it is talking about the political process. The other side of Happy's problem is that he's taking orders from a citizen of his state named Jim Taylor, who runs a lot of businesses and a lot of newspapers, is very influential, and so he has an inordinate amount of influence in state politics and is using that for his own corrupt ends to further a plot for graft. And I don't think that Happy knows the plot, but he is being used as a pawn by Taylor, and Taylor wants him to put a particular man in for senator. The people know this man. They know that he's not honest. They know that he works for Taylor, and so the populace is not happy with this pick. They've got a suggestion. Taylor is not happy with their suggestion, and so Happy finds himself in the middle. So he sits down to dinner with his family and is very flustered, and his kids can see this. And I think it's interesting, the setup of this movie. Happy's got like 8 kids around this table, and these kids wind up giving him his suggestion for senator. They're not suggesting Horace Miller, which is Taylor's man. They're not suggesting Henry Hill, which is the people's choice. Their suggestion is Jefferson Smith. And of course, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This is the Mr. Smith that will be going to Washington. And the setup for this scene is so interesting because it's not an adult who promotes Jeff Smith for Senate. It's these kids, many of whom are boys. And the reason they know who Jefferson Smith is because he's
head of the Boy Rangers.
Oh, a boy.
No, Dad. Jeff's a man. Jeff Smith. Biggest expert we got in wild game and animals and rocks. Yeah, and right now he's the greatest hero we ever had. It's all over the headlines. Sure, didn't you see about the terrific forest fire all around Sweetwater?
I did. What about it?
Well, Jeff put that out himself.
Himself?
Now, if you really want a senator...
I do not want a senator. I do not want any more of this nonsense.
He's the greatest American we got, too, Dad. He can tell you what George Washington said by heart. And boy, stuff's got the swellest stuff in it.
What stuff?
Boy stuff. That's the name of Jeff's paper.
So now we've been fully introduced to Jeff Smith, and our very first introduction to him is Governor Hopper mistaking him for a boy. And this is going to happen a lot. Jeff is going to get compared to boys very often throughout the movie. I think that gets down to the heart of what the theme for the movie is going to be. And then also he winds up making alliances with boys throughout the movie pretty often. He's head of the Boy Rangers, so he has a heart for these boys. And he employs the boys to run his paper, which is called Boys Stuff. And even while he's in the Senate, he winds up finding some boys who, or at least one boy who helps him out in the Senate. So very thematic for Jeff, and I think we'll see why as we continue on. There are several ways you can break a story down. Of course, the most popular way, the way I was taught in school, is to think of a story as having a beginning, middle, and an end. But a lot of the time when you actually get into writing a story, you find that this middle is the longest part of the story. A lot of the time it's twice as long as either your beginning or your end. So practically a story actually has 4 major parts: the beginning, and then the beginning of the middle, and then the end of the middle, and then the very end. But also every story tends to have 9 significant moments, and the first moment and the last moment basically going around the first and the last scenes, and then the other 7 moments basically get distributed around the story circle evenly. And so they break the story up into 8 even chunks, which makes sense because if the story is 4 major parts, basically you put each of these 7 points halfway through one of these parts and you get 8 chunks. So for me, a story is basically 4 acts, and those acts are divided into 8 sections. And the first section of the story starts with the hook, which is basically the argument to the reader or the viewer of why they should continue with the story all the way to the end, what makes the story interesting. And after the hook, the job of that first eighth of the movie is to explain to us who our main character is and what his normal world is like. So the normal world is where the main character has been living prior to the start of the story, what they're used to, what has happened to them in the past that has shaped them. And one of the things that happens to the main character in the past that shapes them is called the ghost, or sometimes it's called the wound. So at the very end of the first eighth of the movie, right before the next significant moment, we find out about Jeff Smith's ghost. We find out that Jeff's dad had a reputation for standing up for people with lost causes. He was known as the champion of lost causes. In fact, Senator Payne was a lawyer at the time, and they both were known as the twin champions of lost causes. But Jeff's dad got shot in the back because he was defending a miner from a corrupt mining syndicate. So as Jeff is reminiscing with Senator Payne about his dad, Clayton Smith, Jeff says,
"I suppose, Mr. Payne, when a fellow bucks up against a big organization like that, one man by himself can't get very far, can he?" "No."
So Jeff starts out with this idea that the movie is going to challenge, which is, can a single person going up against a big organization get very far at all? On the other hand, he's got the memory of his dad, Clayton Smith, who was the champion of lost causes and who told Jeff that lost causes are actually the only ones worth fighting for. So Jeff is actually holding 2 different beliefs. The movie is going to challenge both of them. One of them is going to change and the other will not. And I find this interesting because a big part of discovering the message of the movie is discovering whether the main character is a change arc character or a flat arc character. Do they start out the movie believing a lie, or do they start out believing the truth? Now, Jeff seems to believe both a lie and a truth. I haven't heard of this arc of character before. Yes, wolves are my favorite animal. I think I should say before we go any further that Senator Payne is also in on Jim Taylor's corruption. There's an early scene of the movie where the governor, Happy, is waiting for Jim Taylor to come up with who should be the next senator. And Jim Taylor is consulting with Senator Payne because they're both in on this graft plot that Jim Taylor has started. Now, I had not heard the word graft before I saw this movie, so in case you're anything like me, it's this plot that Jim Taylor and Senator Payne are involved in. They've bought up land under phony names around an area known as Willet Creek, or in the movie they often pronounce it Willet Crick. They're using phony names because the graft plot is that they're going to have the government purchase the land to put a dam on that location, which of course will make Jim Taylor very wealthy. In order to hide the fact that this is a special interest of Jim Taylor, they've had the measure to build a dam on Willet Creek buried in a deficiency bill. So clearly this is underhanded. Senator Payne is using his influence to make sure that this special interest of Taylor's gets buried and obscured. And the reason that Payne is involved in this scheme is because Taylor is the reason that Payne became a senator 20 years ago and continues to hold his office. So Payne wants to maintain a good relationship with Taylor to ensure that he continues to be senator. Now, Jeff has no idea about Senator Payne's history with Jim Taylor. As far as he knows, Payne is this paragon of virtue because of his history with Jeff's dad, Clayton. The next significant moment of the story is the inciting incident, which is the moment that causes the rest of the story to happen. Without the inciting incident, there would be no story. In Jeff's case, the inciting incident is him actually going to Washington. Obviously, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington would not be a story if he did not actually go to Washington. Now, when Jeff arrives in Washington, the train station is kind of a microcosm of his experience of this big city, Washington. There's a lot going on, a lot of people coming to meet him. There's a lot of things to respond to and to attend to. And he is just lost and overwhelmed. But he sees the Capitol Dome outside of the train station and forgets everything else. Forgets that there are people and obligations and places he needs to be. He just heads straight for the Capitol Dome and winds up getting on a touring bus and seeing the city for about 5 hours. And one of the locations that he stops at is the Lincoln Memorial. And that's going to be important later because of some of the quotations that are in the Lincoln Memorial. I think, again, they represent the heart of the movie, what it is that this movie wants us to walk away with. For now, I'm going to skip this part. It doesn't really have as much meaning now as it will later on in combination with some other parts of the movie. Well, eventually he gets back to his office. His secretary is not too happy to have been kept waiting for him. She's actually pretty flustered with the whole situation. She worked for the previous senator, who was also, just like Senator Payne, was also under Jim Taylor's thumb. So she's familiar with Taylor and with Willet Crick and all of the goings on there. She can see that this new senator doesn't know anything about what he's supposed to be doing. He is clearly just another plant by Jim Taylor. She is tired of the corruption. She wants out. And she decides she's going to go out with a bang. And so she sends some reporters to interview her new boss, Senator Jeff Smith. Now, she's friends with a reporter named Diz Moore, but he's not chasing down this scoop. No, the reporters who go and get the story on Jeff Smith are not the scrupulous type. They trick him into giving them unflattering pictures. They misconstrue his words. They play up the drama of his arrival in Washington, D.C. So by the time he finds out about it, he's none too happy about what they've done with his name. Now, this media mishap is actually the next significant moment in the movie, which is the first plot point. And this is the barrier between the first quarter of the movie and everything that comes after, the other 4 acts. The first plot point represents when the character goes from their normal world to an abnormal world. In the normal world, they had a certain set of actions and behaviors that made sense to them and got them what they wanted, but it didn't help them to become the character that they needed to be, and it didn't help them to change the world into what the world needed to be. In the case of a flat art character, a lot of the time the first plot point is something that's instigated by the character, probably by some flaw that the character has. For instance, in this case, Jeff is pretty naive. And so the reporters were able to take advantage of his naivety in order to misconstrue him in the papers. It's also very significant how the main character reacts to the inciting incident. In this case, we don't see Jeff's reaction until after he's had a day at the Senate, when he discovers how the media has mishandled his name. There's also kind of a floating moment called the key event. The key event clarifies the inciting incident. For instance, Jeff goes to Washington. He's been picked out of nowhere to be the senator. He doesn't really have a good sense of why it is that he's going. He feels like it's all been a mistake, as he says in his speech before he heads off to Washington. It's this moment with the newspapers that really starts to bring everything together, because it's at this moment that Jeff tells the newspapers that if he has an opportunity to do anything in Washington, what he'd really like to do is establish a national boys' camp in his state. And that's going to be an important detail later on that is going to tie him in with the corruption that's going on at Willet Crick and going to help him blast that open. The key moment happens anywhere between the inciting incident and the first plot point, so anywhere in the second eighth of the story. In this case, it happens at the first plot point. Before we move along, I want to talk about Jeff's naivety for a moment. This is a critical flaw that gets highlighted in stark colors throughout the movie, gets held in Jeff's face again and again and again. And I think a excellent picture of this naivety has been brought forth when he goes to the Senate for his first day of service there. This is the day that he's actually taking the oath of office to come into the Senate. It's also the day that another senator confronts him with the newspaper articles and blames him for this story. So his naivety could be costing him his career in the Senate before he even gets to serve. But what I want to point out is I've mentioned before how there's a little boy in the Senate who helps him to find his place there. And I'm sure that every senator gets the same treatment, but it's just such a perfect picture of what is going on in Jeff's mind as he's trying to get acclimatized to the Senate. There's this little boy, even this little boy knows more about being a senator than Jeff Smith does. So as I have said before, Jeff finds out about his portrayal in the newspapers, and he chases some journalists down to the National Press Club. And he thinks he's going in there to confront them about how they should be telling the people the truth. But he actually gets the tables turned on him. They confront him with how little he actually knows about being a senator.
If it's the truth you want, what are you doing in the Senate?
What do you know about laws or making laws or what the people need?
I don't pretend to know.
And what are you doing in the Senate?
What's he doing? Why, honorary appointments.
When the country needs men up there who know and have courage as it never did before, he's just going to decorate a chair and get himself honored.
Oh, but he'll vote. Sure, just like his colleague tells him to.
Yes, sir, like a Christmas tiger. He'll nod his head and vote.
Yes.
You're not a senator. You're an honorary stooge. You ought to be shown up.
Have a drink, Senator?
It'll taste better than the truth.
And we watch as Jeff goes through this transformation. He comes into the room like a tiger. And then as the journalists confront him on his ignorance of how to make the laws that will benefit his state, you see him just deflate. He becomes less like a tiger and more like the Christmas tiger that the journalists are accusing him of. From what I understand, that's a toy like a bobblehead. So they're saying he's just going to vote yes, like his colleague tells him to. And they remind me of a gang of jesters, really, the way that they're mocking and yet as they're laughing and making jokes, they're also revealing something that Jeff Smith needs to know, which is that he doesn't know enough to fill the position that he's been selected to fill. And Jeff shows exceptional wisdom for someone who's as naive as he is, because he doesn't insist that he's right. He doesn't maintain a sense of pride about his position. He deflates, he falls silent, and he walks out of the room without saying another word. So now we're well into the second quarter of the story, and the second quarter is all about proving to the main character that their old way of living will not fly in this new world that they have now stepped into. Jeff has stepped into this new world of the Senate and politics, and his naivety is just not going to do him any good here. And the second quarter of the story is divided in half by what is called the first pinch point. Every story has 2 pinch points, and what these pinch points share in common is that they bring the antagonistic force of the story to the forefront. An antagonist may be a person, sometimes it's not a person in some stories. So the antagonistic force is kind of an umbrella term for whatever the primary source of opposition to the hero is going to be. So as Jeff is discovering the truth about his appointment through these reporters, of course, we know that his secretary Saunders pulled off these shenanigans because she wanted to quit. And we get a scene with her and Senator Payne where he's not impressed. He's not going to let her quit. He incentivizes her to stay with a bonus, and he tells her to keep Jeff away from politics. Of course, now that Jeff has met the journalists and he's concerned that they're right, he doesn't know anything about the Senate. How can he do his job there? He goes to see Senator Payne and says, if I'm just following your advice about these bills, I may as well not be there at all. I'm going to be useless here. So in order to calm Jeff down, Senator Payne suggests he put a bill into action. And he saw in the papers that Jeff wanted to build a boys' camp. Why don't you go ahead and get that started? So Jeff comes back to his office and tells his secretary, and at first she doesn't like the idea, but he says, Senator Payne said that you'd help me with this. So the first thing that she does to help Jeff is to explain exactly what happens to make a bill into a law. It's a long and arduous process. And as viewers, we should be watching this and seeing that Senator Payne basically fed Jeff Smith a red herring. We see that Senator Payne is actively conniving to prevent Jeff from getting involved in politics. He thinks that if he can get Jeff so wrapped up in his own bill, Jeff won't have time to notice there's a corrupt deficiency bill floating around. Now, as Jeff is developing this bill with Saunders, he tells her why he wants to build this camp. And it's about more than just instilling American values into boys. It's that he has this sense of gratitude to the founding fathers for the liberty that he has, and he feels a responsibility to make sure that other people have that liberty. And this is where I want to go back to the Lincoln Memorial, which Jeff visited on his tour, because the quotes that we see in the Lincoln Memorial really highlight Jeff's heart here. One of these quotes gets read by a little boy. How thematic. It comes from the Gettysburg Address. And since it's being read aloud, we know that whoever was behind the decision to have that boy read that quote thought it was meaningful that we listen to it and incorporate that in our understanding of the movie. The boy says,
that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So Jeff's values very much echo Lincoln's values. Lincoln was inspired by the devotion shown by the soldiers who gave their lives at Gettysburg. His gratitude at their devotion made him want to fight to extend freedom to the people of his country. And furthermore, he was fighting to continue the government that had already existed, one of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so we see this motion where gratitude is inspiring a fighting spirit for the sake of others. So Jeff's secretary Saunders helped him to develop his bill and coaches him on how to present it in the Senate. And she's really a sympathetic character. She's just caught in a bad place, been entangled in politics. She's trying to make the best of it by accepting this bonus, since she's not really in a position to escape on her own terms. And she finds Jeff's ideals appealing, even though she knows that they're not going to fit in the environment of Washington. But she tells him how to present his bill. He goes into the Senate and he starts to present his bill. And meanwhile, she's watching up in the gallery, knowing that as soon as he says the words "Will it crick," that is going to set off a chain reaction concerning Senator Payne and those who are involved in this corrupt scheme. As soon as Senator Payne and a fellow named Chick McGann, who's been acting as Jeff's escort and is in on this plan, as soon as they realize that Jeff is starting to get in their way, they've got to figure out how to get him out of the way. So Senator Payne decides to have his daughter, who he knows Jeff is kind of infatuated with, decides to have her invite him out to a special event on the day that the deficiency bill is going to be read in the Senate. Because when Jeff hears that bill, he'll realize that Willet Creek Dam is going to be on the same Willet Creek that he's hoping to put his boys' camp on, and he'll start to investigate. So Jeff falls for it. He goes out with Senator Payne's daughter, Susan. And meanwhile, Saunders, his secretary, is so grieved by what she's seeing here. This isn't fair. They're taking advantage of him. They're fooling him when he doesn't know any better. She gets herself all worked up. She is ready to quit. And as she's about to leave for good, she tells Jeff exactly what's going on with the deficiency bill, just in time for the midpoint, the very halfway mark of the story. So I've mentioned the midpoint a couple other times on this channel. It's a very significant point in stories. This is when the main character gets a full dose of the truth. In this case, Jeff gets the full explanation of this corrupt deficiency bill and Willet Creek Dam, and how he is just a pawn for the corrupt forces in his state. So while we're on this scene, I wanted to point out something interesting I saw. Saunders is raiding her desk, getting everything out so that she can walk out for the last time and quit for real this time. And of all the things that she pulls out of her desk drawer, what she pulls out is this doll. And she's talking to Jeff and is very upset, and she's holding this doll and it's just dangling by one arm next to her. And what in the world is a doll doing in a Senate secretary's desk? How did that get in there? Why did that stay there? There probably was no backstory explanation for this in the plan, but someone decided to have her holding a doll during this important scene. And I think I understand why. Because I've been pointing out again and again how Jeff gets really tied in with boyhood here. And I think it's an image that's getting given to us to highlight his naivety. He is like a child coming into the Senate, and even the children in the Senate know more than he does. And these page boys that assist. So he has this boyish naivety about him. Now, Saunders, basically throughout the story, seems to know what it is that there is to know. She knows about the corruption. She knows about Willet Creek Dam. Even Governor Happy doesn't know about Willet Creek Dam, but Saunders knows about Willet Creek Dam. She is well aware of everything going on, but in this scene, they chose to give her this doll to hang on to from her desk, as she's really upset, explaining to Jeff just how much of a fool he is. And of course, in this story, they're also trying to tie together a love interest between Jeff and Saunders. I personally don't think it was necessary. I think they made the decision so that they could entertain those who maybe wouldn't be entertained by the political machinations going on. So if you're husband and wife in the theater and one prefers the politics and the other one doesn't, maybe they'll be strung along by the romance. I don't think the romance has any explanatory value in the story. But it definitely does, her holding this doll definitely does kind of tie her in thematically with Jeff. It gives them a common point of ground. He is this boy coming into the Senate as far as his sense of political acumen. And as she is watching him get used by the corrupt side, she is becoming a little girl when she finally is able to come out and tell him what's going on. So again, I think this is some emotional tying together so that it makes sense when they eventually fall in love at the end of the movie. I don't think that's a big spoiler. I think you can see it going through the movie, and it doesn't really explain anything that happens in the movie. And if you don't know by now that I'm going to give spoilers, well, I am going to give spoilers, so beware. One of the things that makes the story's midpoint the midpoint is that it changes the approach of the main character to the rest of the story. For the first half of the story, he's been in reaction mode. Things have been happening to him, his world's got turned upside down, and he's trying to figure out how to find his feet again. With the midpoint, he's got the truth, and if he's a change character, he's going to grab onto it and hold on to it. If he's a flat art character, he's already got the truth, and he's starting to use it to to really affect the world around him. This is when he goes from being a reactionary character to an actionary character to actually starting to be on the offensive against whatever the antagonistic force is in this story. So in this case, Jeff, once he gets told by his departing secretary that that he's had the wool pulled over his eyes, the first thing he does is goes to Senator Payne and confronts him about this. He says, "I was told that this is a plot for graft. Who's Taylor?" And that sets a chain of events in place that eventually brings Taylor to Washington, D.C. to meet with Jeff face to face. And his first approach to Smith is he tries to bribe him. Says, "Do you like business? I can send you straight to the top of any business you want in the state. Do you like politics? You can come back to the Senate and stay in the Senate for as long as you want to." And that's when Smith starts to realize that Payne is in the Senate because of Taylor. He says, "Are you telling these men and Senator Payne what to do?" And Taylor confirms it. But Jeff doesn't really believe it. He accuses Taylor of being a liar. So again, he goes to Senator Payne himself. And by now we've come to the second pinch point of the movie. We have the midpoint, and on either side of the midpoint, the significant moments are the first and second pinch point. So the second pinch point is when he comes to Senator Payne and confronts him and gets confirmation that, yeah, actually Taylor was telling the truth. Senator Payne compromised in order to be able to get into the Senate. He's justified it to himself, saying that he's serving the state from the Senate better than he could have done if he'd done it honestly. He just needed to compromise. And again, the theme of the story raises its head here when Senator Payne tells Smith,
"You've been living in a boy's world, Jeff, and for heaven's sake, stay there. This is a man's world. It's a brutal world, Jeff, and you've no place in it. You'll only get hurt."
By this point, Jeff's beyond being surprised when people tell him how little he knows. He goes into the Senate the next day, prepared to expose this bill. Senator Payne walks in, and as soon as he hears the words Willet Creek, he stands up and asks if Smith will yield the floor. Smith respects Senator Payne, so of course he'll yield the floor, and that's when Senator Payne accuses Smith of having bought the land that he's that he's asking the government to buy in the bill for the boys' camp that he set up. He's basically accusing Jeff of doing the same thing that he and Jim Taylor are colluding together to do. The Senate, Movie Magic quickly gets a hearing together to find out, to get down to the bottom of this, because they're not going to tolerate a dishonest senator staying in office. So they hold this hearing, and Smith is just shocked. There's a man from his state who says that he bought the land from him. He's got a contract. He's even got Jeff's signature on it. Jeff didn't sign that contract. There's experts that claim that the signature is not a forgery. And then Senator Payne stands up and talks about this phony conversation that he had with Smith, encouraging him to think twice about his boys' camp bill until he realized just what Smith was up to. So Smith, it's his turn for him to stand up and defend himself, but he is just so shocked at the level of dishonesty coming at him, especially from Senator Payne, his father's friend, the champion of lost causes, the Silver Knight, that he just walks out of the room. He's got nothing to say. In the next scene, we see him at the Lincoln Monument, and he's got 2 suitcases with him. It's clear he is on his way out of Washington, D.C. But he's just in so much grief that he sets down his suitcases and sits where he is. And suddenly there's Saunders standing by a pillar of the monument. She says, "I thought I'd find you here when I didn't find you anywhere else." And he says, "You had me figured out all along. You told me to go home and keep filling those boys' head full of hooey. Well, I'm going to go home and tell them the truth about all the corruption in Washington, D.C." But Saunders has changed her tune.
Your friend Mr. Lincoln had his tailors and pains. So did every other man who ever tried to lift his thought up off the ground. Odds against him didn't stop those men. They were fools that way. All the good that ever came into this world came from fools with faith like that. You know that, Jeff. You can't quit now. Not you. They aren't all tailors and pains in Washington. That kind just throw big shadows, that's all. You didn't just have faith in Payne or any other living man. You had faith in something bigger than that. You had plain, decent, everyday, common rightness. And this country could use some of that.
So Jeff's been beaten over the head again and again with the message that he knows nothing about the Senate. He doesn't belong in the Senate. He should just go home. And his answer finally to being at the lowest point of the movie, which this is going to be the lowest point in any movie, just after that second pinch point and before the third plot point, which I'll talk about in a bit. But here at the lowest point of the movie, his answer finally is, okay, I'm naive. I don't know what's going on. I didn't have any right to think I should be here. I'm just going to go home. I don't have any place in politics because I have no idea what I'm doing. And her answer is, your naivety doesn't disqualify you from doing what's right. You know what's right, that you're on the right track. And now you shouldn't quit just because you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. You should keep going ahead doing what's right. And her answer reminds me of a quote there at the Lincoln Monument that we saw earlier when Jeff was going on tour. It's from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. And it says, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. So Jeff and Saunders leave the scene to go and discuss her plan for how he should fight Jim Taylor. And as they leave that scene, we're stepping into the third plot point of the movie. Why do I say third plot point? Where was the second plot point? Well, actually, the second plot point was the midpoint. So the first plot point happens in the first quarter of the movie. The midpoint is right in the halfway mark of the movie, and that's the second plot point. And then at the mark for the between the third and fourth quarter of the movie, that is the final plot point, the third plot point. And in order to step into the third plot point, you really have to have all your ducks in a row. All of the things that you're going to need to finally defeat the antagonistic force need to be in place. So now that Saunders is here and she's on board to help Jeff fight, that is the last thing that Jeff needs in order to go to battle against the corruption that is in the Senate through Jim Taylor. The next day in the Senate, they're about to vote him out. We hear from Saunders' journalist friend Diz talking to another journalist that Jeff has not been seen in the Senate since the Senate hearing. But today he shows up and he is ready to go to figurative battle for his seat in the Senate. There's definitely some verbal wrangling. The Senate doesn't want him there. The Senate is ready to push him out, but thankfully the president, I think I understand it's supposed to be the vice president presiding over the Senate, but they always address this gentleman played by Harry Carey as Mr. President. He's fair enough to give Jeff a chance to speak for himself in the Senate, and that's where we start to enter the climax of the movie. So from the third plot point, we start to enter into climax territory, and then halfway through that final act, the final fourth of the movie, halfway through, is when the climactic moment really hits. This is around the time where the most poignant part of the battle is going to take place. So as Jeff is speaking, trying to defend himself, he says, I got some pretty good coaching last night, and I find if I refuse to yield except for a question or a point of order or a personal privilege, then I can hold this floor almost until doomsday. And so Saunders has taught Jeff and me what a filibuster is. And so Jeff is now standing there and has to be very careful about who he's going to yield the floor to in order to keep his right to speak. The senators will not delay the deficiency bill because baked into that bill is some stuff that is supposed to really help the country. They don't want to delay it, but he doesn't want to pass it because also in there is that corrupt measure about Willet Creek Dam. And so he is going to hold the floor as long as it takes to defeat that deficiency bill so that what he has to say can get back to his home state, and his home state can pass a petition back because the home state knows who Jim Taylor is, and then the Senate will know that Jeff was in the right the whole time. And while Jeff is speaking, he gets to talk about his principles, especially why he wants to build this boys' camp, which I think is really interesting and informative to us, the audience.
It's a funny thing about men, you know. They all start life being boys. I wouldn't be a bit surprised some of these senators were boys once. And that's why it seemed like a pretty good idea to me to get boys out of crowded cities and stuffy basements for a couple of months out of the year and build their bodies and minds for man-sized job, because those boys are going to be behind these desks some of these days. It seemed like a pretty good idea, getting boys from all over the country, boys of all nationalities and ways of living, getting them together. Let them find out what makes different people tick the way they do. Because I wouldn't give you 2 cents for all your fancy rules if behind them they didn't have a little bit of plain, ordinary, everyday kindness. And a little looking out for the other fella, too.
Earlier we found out that Jeff is grateful to the Founding Fathers and he wants to extend the liberty that they gave to him on to others. Well, how is he going to do that with a boys' camp? What is the whole purpose behind that? He tells us these boys he knows are going to grow up to be men someday, men who may actually enter politics. And these camps are an opportunity to get boys of all types together, not only to grow their bodies and minds, but also to encourage them to love one another as fellow human beings, no matter what their nationality. I think it's pretty vogue these days to assume that something from the era that this movie was presented in couldn't possibly be nuanced about a subject like diversity. This sounds pretty good to me. And if those boys can learn to love one another, no matter what their differences are, they'll be well set up to be politicians who can establish laws for the benefit of mankind. Now, if you were watching the clip, you saw cuts where the senators are sitting there because basically there's a ruling that says there must be a quorum. So they're going in shifts to maintain a quorum, but they're not listening. They're reading the newspaper. And I don't know about you, but if I'm reading something, I am not listening to someone else. So I think the climactic moment here in this movie is when Jeff is getting so desperate to be heard that he whistles in the middle of his speech. And when everyone in the chamber turns around to look at him, he says, "Oh, don't worry, that I was just wondering if you guys still had faces." So it's an interesting joke, but it shows that he's starting to get desperate. They're not listening. He's not having an impact on the senators. What he doesn't know is that Jim Taylor, outside of the Senate chamber, is using his influence in the newspapers to ensure that all of the newspapers in Jeff's state are giving stories that are slanted against Jeff. They're smearing Jeff. So none of what he's saying is getting out to his state for his own state to petition back to stop the Willet Creek Dam. So Jeff is standing here expending his energy, fighting a losing battle, and he whistles to make sure that the Senate is listening and manages to get their attention for at least a moment. Now, I could be wrong about whether or not this is the climactic moment. If you've been counting significant moments, then by now we've reached number 9. Except we've got one more to go because I forgot to count the key event because that one kind of moves around a bit. So the significant moment I originally considered to be the 9th is the resolution. Once the climax is over, then we kind of get a chance to see the world settling into a new normal where the hero has changed it for the better, hopefully, or has changed for the better, and so the way he views the world is different. This movie doesn't really have much of a resolution. The climax continues to build until right almost the last second of the movie, and then there is an intense explosion of celebration once Smith finally wins, but we don't see any change in the world after that, other than we assume that deficiency bill is not going to go forward with the Willet Creek Dam measure still within it. Because that resolution moment is not as large as I would expect, I think there's room for the climactic moment to be more toward the end. As I said, the climax keeps building. Jeff continues speaking. He talks about the Declaration of Independence. He reads through the Constitution. He even reads a section out of the Bible, which I'll talk about. And Saunders outside has discovered his paper, Boys Stuff, so she tries to enlist them to help get the news out to the state, but those boys are getting run down by Taylor's men in the state. So nothing is working. And the hottest part of the climax is really after Jeff has been talking for almost 24 hours. Senator Payne gets him to yield for a question and asks if he'd like to see the response from his state, which Jeff would. And Senator Payne calls in just barrel-sized baskets full of telegrams and letters, petitions from the state to get Senator Smith to stop talking. What can Smith do in the face of the public mandate for him to stop speaking? Before the third plot point, his answer was to leave Washington, D.C. But by now, he's gone through a profound change. He decides he is going to remain on the floor and continue speaking, hoping someone will listen to him. And he gives the reason why he continues to fight for this lost cause.
All you people don't know about lost causes. Mr. Payne does. He said once they were the only causes worth fighting for. And he fought for them once. For the only reason any man ever fights for them. Because of just one plain, simple rule. Love thy neighbor. And in this world today full of hatred, a man who knows that one rule has a great trust. You know that rule, Mr. Payne. And I loved you for it just as my father did. And you know that you fight for the lost causes harder than for any others. Yes, you even die for them. Like a man we both knew, Mr. Payne.
This rule that Jeff is reminding Senator Payne of comes from the Bible. And I want to read one of the passages where Jesus spoke about this rule. At the time that he was on earth, he had some disputes with a religious sect called the Pharisees. The Pharisees thought they knew the way to God, but they were very legalistic and actually wound up leading many away from God's plan of salvation, which included Jesus Christ. So Jesus had a lot to say against them. And in this passage, he is discussing the scriptures with them. They're trying to snare him up, trying to ask him questions to trip him up, which is impossible for him because he's the Son of God. But they were trying to get one over on him anyway. And this passage in Mark chapter 12, verse 28 through 34, tells us one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? And apparently this was a popular question that students of Jewish rabbis would ask their rabbis, their teachers, to find out of everything that I have to do to be right with God, what is the most important thing? What should I really get down to be right with God? And sometimes people might have asked that question trying to dodge the rest of the law, trying to not have to do everything that the law says. What's the one thing? What's the one secret? What's the one hack that will make me successful at this? We have this popularly on YouTube nowadays. If you look at any self-help channel or any channel that is advising anyone on anything. And so this scribe says, which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord with your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And honestly, I can't think of any possible law or rule that you could give someone that doesn't fit in one of those if it's a good law or rule. So there's no dodging all the other laws in the Old Testament through this answer. And the scribe said to him, You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one and there is no other besides him, and to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Now, Jesus was quoting a law out of the Jewish law. We find it in the first 5 books of the Bible, in the Torah, as the Jews call it. In Christian circles, it's often called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And this particular law is in Leviticus 19. So here it is, Leviticus 19, 17, and 18. Especially 18, but I wanted to include 17. "You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him." And again, with our online communities, I think we tend to lean towards hating people who think differently from us or believe different things. And there's a lot of people who insist that they will not reason with someone different than them, and I think that's a mistake. It continues here, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Now, a little bit further down in this chapter, I found an interesting passage here, Leviticus 19:33. "When a stranger," so that's someone who is not Jewish, "when a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself." So there's that phrase again, "You shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So here we have an interesting verse that ties in that command, even love someone who is not Jewish, even love someone who's of another ethnicity or nationality from you. And the reason you're going to love this person who is so different from you is because you were foreigners in another land. You were slaves in the land of Egypt. And you remember what that was like. You remember how God rescued you from that land. And in gratitude to the God who rescued you, you're going to show love to these strangers. So there's a spirit of gratitude, just like Jeff Smith was grateful to the founding fathers for giving him the liberty that he wants to extend to other people. So the Jews of Israel were, out of gratitude to God for their rescue, be willing to love the sojourner in their land. Now, Jeff was reading from a passage of the Bible from this chapter in 1 Corinthians. The 1 Corinthians 13 is known among Christians as the love chapter. It gives us this definition for what love looks like. It starts, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant." And it is this verse that Jeff reads in the movie. He's reading from the King James Version of the Bible, which I can pull up quickly here. He reads, "Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up." So that's the section we see. And then to the end of the chapter, he reads this verse here. "So now faith, hope, and love abide, these 3. But the greatest of these is love." So the whole point of 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is of how useless anything else done in humanity or in the name of God is if it's not done in this spirit of love. And the reason that is so important, we're skipping on to the book of 1 John chapter 4, verse 7, and I'm going to be reading all the way to verse 21. Love is a property of God. This is part of God's nature. Apparently the most important part of God's nature, if we believe 1 Corinthians 13. This passage tells us, "Brothers, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love." In this, the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world, that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us, and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. So this is a big word that you may not hear if you're not familiar with church and the language of the Bible. It means that that Jesus coming to earth, Jesus, the Son of God, God the Son, came to earth in human form, and he lived his entire human life of 33 years without any sin at all. He did not allow himself to do anything that was for himself solely, that was in rebellion against God. Every single human being rebels against God except for Jesus Christ. And so Jesus denied himself all throughout his life, and finally he died a criminal's death on the cross. He was falsely accused of both of blasphemy, which was definitely not true, him being the Son of God, and also of rebelling against the Roman authorities at the time, which he did not do either. And he was killed on the cross, but he was taking on our sin, the punishment for our sin himself, and his sacrifice was the appeasement of the penalty that we deserve. So that's the idea behind the word propitiation, is that his sacrifice appeased the demand of the penalty that we deserve to pay for all the crimes that we commit against God. And then the Bible tells us that Jesus, 3 days after he died, did rise again from the grave, which tells us that he was qualified to save us from our sins, that God was pleased with his sacrifice. And so when we accept that sacrifice as salvation for our sins, we are in line with God's plan, and God has promised to save us from our sin and to forgive us for those sins. So Jesus gave this great sacrifice. He first loved us, and now we who are saved through that sacrifice have this gratitude within us, where we, because we're so grateful for that sacrifice, we want to then express our love back to God and to others, because as we're seeing in this passage, that's what God wants from us. And this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. So there's that spirit of gratitude buried in this verse. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in him, and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. And I talked about that gift of God's Spirit in the last video I made on this channel on the Legend of the Guardians movie. We have seen and have testified that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. Whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment. Because as he is, so also are we in this world. So because of Jesus' sacrifice, because we know that he loves us, when we accept that reality, when we accept that sacrifice on our behalf, then we can have confidence in the love that Jesus showed us, and that we will not fall under judgment. We're told there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. If you're afraid of how you're going to be punished, you're not thinking about other people, you're not expressing love, you're only thinking about yourself. We love because he first loved us. Again, that gratitude. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. So there's this very firm bond between these commands, between these ideas. Jesus expressed his love to us. We are grateful for the love that he expressed to us, and now we want to express that love to other people. out of gratitude to God, and a desire to show God's love back to him as well. This is one of the great things about stories, because for me to boil down the message of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I would be telling you something along the lines of we have received liberty, among other good things, based on what people have done in our past, and a spirit of gratitude for those things should be driving us to try to extend those good things to people in the future. And we may face the problem that we don't know how to extend those good things to others in the future. We may find ourselves running in where angels fear to tread, but the proper answer to that is not to turn around and give up. The proper answer is motivated by love, directing our efforts in love for others, for the people around us, for the people who are less fortunate or able than ourselves. We should be continuing to try to extend the good that we are grateful to have received ourselves. So I say that, and it's long and wordy to try to explain, and it's not very emotionally impactful, but you see a film like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and all of that message is boiled in and holds our attention for the whole time of the film, and it's all soaking in gradually as we continue to watch this movie and see how Mr. Smith finally solves the problem of corruption in his state and in Washington, D.C. And I'll let you find out what happens at the end of the movie. I feel like telling you exactly how the movie closes takes us away from the point, the meaning that I wanted to examine, which is, as I've told you already. I am currently in this shirt, editing the video on Thanksgiving Day, so I hope you've had a great Thanksgiving holiday if you're in the U.S., and if you're not in the U.S., I hope that you have a great, whatever the next holiday is that you'll be celebrating. We're looking forward to Christmas coming now. As it turns out, the movie is heavily founded on gratitude, so I guess that's appropriate. My plan is to release this video on Saturday after Thanksgiving. I hope this video is a blessing to you, and God bless you.